So what is composting? I mean, this seems like a really simple question, but it's really not. We put our stuff into a pile, we see it turn brown, and we have this stuff called finished compost. But what exactly is that? And I'd like to look at that in a little more detail. So this is what it looks like. Those banana peels are gone. We don't see them anymore. But the reason we don't see them anymore is because our eyes aren't very good at seeing this kind of stuff. We can't see molecules. We don't know what's going on a molecular basis. So on a very high level, that banana has turned into some brown stuff, and we call that finished. But in fact, on a molecular basis, this finished compost is just really starting the journey towards where it's going. If we look at that original pile, we've got all kinds of things in there. But on a molecular basis, we have a lot of these large molecules. So things like proteins, starch, DNA, fats, lignin. Well, when we look at this on a molecular basis, there really is very little difference between all this stuff that we put in there. You know, a banana peel and a leaf from a maple tree are very, very similar on a molecular basis. The key here is that these are large molecules and plants can't use any of this. It's completely useless for plants. When we look at protein molecules, they're huge. They're like 100,000 different atoms in this. And buried inside is a bunch of nitrogen. And in fact, protein has about 16% nitrogen in there, completely useless to plants, because as long as it's in this large molecule, it's tied away and plants can't use it. Here's a picture of a DNA molecule, and it's even bigger than protein molecules. And those blue spots in the middle there are phosphate molecules. Again, plants can't use this. It's tied up. The process of composting is actually one where microbes come along and start digesting all of this large stuff. And they start with the banana skin. And they first have to start digesting the actual outer layers of the cells and degrade that. Then the insides spill out. And you might think, well, okay, that's good for plants. But in fact, most of the things inside those cells are large molecules that plants can't use. So microbes go to working on that and slowly degrade all that. And what people don't understand is that finished compost really isn't finished for about 5 years. So when we take it from the pile and we put it in our garden, we call it finished. And then for the next 5 years, it's slowly feeding the garden as that decomposition continues. Here's a profile that shows the temperature changes that take place in a hot composting pile. And we start out at sort of normal air temperature, and we see an increase in temperature. And while these temperatures are changing, the population of the microbes in there are continually changing. So some like to work at lower temperatures, some work at higher temperatures. Initially, a lot of the fungi are in there because those cell walls are too hard for microbes to digest. They really can't do anything with it. So the fungi come along and they're able to handle things like lignin that's too hard to digest. Only after that stuff gets started and that's being decomposed, then the bacteria can come in and take over and get more involved. But we have this constant change of microbes throughout this whole cycle. And all those microbes are in and on the stuff we're putting in that compost pile. They're already in there, and there's thousands of different species in there. And as the temperature changes, those are constantly cycling around. Some will die off. Some will go in a state of hibernation. Others start becoming more active and start growing and multiplying. And then the conditions aren't right for it. And this could be temperature, it could be the pH. And they start dying off. And then others take over. And that whole process goes along. And then we have this maturation period where a lot of the larger material starts looking like a nice brown material that we call compost. So why does compost get hot? Why do we go through this cycle? And the answer is it's the same reason that we get hot when we exercise. We're taking certain molecules, which are mostly sugars and carbohydrates, and we're digesting those. So we're taking those molecules, breaking them up and extracting the energy from that. That extra energy, a lot of that gets converted into heat. And that's why we perspire when we exercise, because we're using up more sugar. The same thing happens in the compost pile. Bacteria and these microbes are busy working, and they're digesting the food that they're eating. And that digestion process requires energy, but also generates excess energy, and the whole thing warms up. Composting a lot of times is described as, getting the right amounts of browns and greens together. And this is a very common way to explain it, and it's sort of a handy way to explain it, but it has a number of difficulties. It's not really the best way to get hot compost. People say things like 3 parts brown to 1 part green, mix that together, and that's the perfect recipe, and that will give you hot compost. So there's a couple problems here. One is that the colors don't really indicate whether something's a brown or a green, right? So we have something like manure, which is colored brown, but is actually a green. We have other things that are green that are really brown. So if we take grass clippings, for instance, if I have fresh grass clippings, they're a green, but in a couple of days they brown off, but they still have a fair amount of nitrogen in them. So they're really still green material. The first problem is the color. We can't really tell whether something is a brown or a green. Coffee grounds is another good example that's really brown but is actually a green in this mixture. It's an approximation. It's better than nothing, but it's not a very accurate way to make really hot compost. Another thing that people talk about is this ratio. So we want a 30-to-1 ratio. Browns to greens is a 30-to-1. And this is an incorrect statement. That 30-to-1 ratio actually refers to the carbon-nitrogen ratio, not the browns to green ratio. When we look at the CN ratio, it is 30-to-1. But now we're looking at something different. We're actually looking at the amount of carbon and the amount of nitrogen in a particular material. So here I've listed a few of them. Coffee grounds has a value of somewhere around 25. What that means is that for each molecule of nitrogen, there are 25 molecules of carbon. So it has a bit more nitrogen than that 30-to-1 ratio. And we can go through the list and we can identify those values for most of the things that we would put into a compost pile. And in fact, the book does have a list in there, and you can find some of these on the internet as well. It is important to know what the CN ratio is of your material if you're going to try to mix this to make really good hot compost. So where does the number 30 come from? Why is it a 30-to-1 ratio that is our target? Why isn't it 10-to-1 or 100-to-1? It turns out that when microbes are active, when they're really growing well, they use about 30 atoms of carbon for every atom of nitrogen. So that's their ideal food source. In fact, it's actually closer to 25. So if we give them a ratio of 25, that will make the microbes grow at their maximum rate. The reason we use 30 is that as those microbes are actively growing, they use up some of the nitrogen, and some of that is lost to the air. So over time, the nitrogen level drops. So we start them a little on the high side. So we're at 30. And then by the time the compost is finished, we're probably at 20. And what they want to be at is about 25. So they're kind of in between that starting point and the ending point. But that's where the ratio comes from. It's actually based on the biology of bacteria. And so that ratio will mean that the microbes can work as fast as possible. That gives us the high temperature because they're generating a lot of heat when they're active, and they produce compost as fast as possible. And that's really the importance of this ratio. It's not that we need the ratio to make compost. We need the ratio to make fast compost and hot compost. There's another complication here, and that is that all these numbers that we've been talking about, they're based on weights. And in fact, they're based on usually dry weights, sometimes wet weights. And you have to be very careful when you look at your source. If you get a CN ratio for something, you have to know whether it's a dry ratio or a wet ratio. but it is a weight. The problem is gardeners don't weigh things. We don't go out in our backyards to make a compost pile with a nice scale and we start weighing everything. We do things in volumes, right? Wheelbarrow fulls or shovel fulls, bucket fulls. There's quite a difference between the weight and the volume. Any of those rules for getting to 30 to 1 is based on weight, not on volume. So I did come up with a system that's more garden orientated, and this one is based on volume. And I tried to simplify this. So in the book, I actually go through the detailed calculations. So if you want to be really accurate, you take each of your ingredients, you measure the volume, you get the CN ratio, and then there's a fairly complicated formula to work out what do you put together and how much of each one, so you get this 30 to 1 ratio. That's just really complicated for most people. So I've simplified that whole process and came up with this. Take all your ingredients and make 3 piles. Pile A, which is the blue pile there, is anything that has a ratio of less than 30. The middle one is between 30 and 100, and anything over 100 goes in that C column, the yellow. So now you've got 3 ingredients, 3 piles, and you just mix them, and you do this in volumes. So for every light green pile, you put in 2 blues, and for every yellow, you put in 8 blues, and you just mix all that together. And that's a pretty good approximation to get that 30 to 1 ratio. So the other question is, does it have to be hot? And the real answer is no, it doesn't. So a hot compost does a couple things for us. It's faster. Number 2 is that it tends to kill weed seeds. So if we get up to the high temperature of a hot compost, we generally have killed all the weed seeds and they're no longer a problem. But a lot of weed seeds die anyways in the composting process. And a lot of the material we put into the compost pile doesn't really have a lot of seeds that we have to worry about. So that may not be an issue. The third concern are pathogens. So the idea here is that we get it hot enough to kill off all these pathogens that are in there. I think there's some validity to that. Obviously, the high temperatures will kill off pathogens. The problem is that where did those pathogens come from? Well, we took yard waste, we collected it from the garden, and we put it in the pile. And that's covered in all kinds of microbes, including pathogens. Well, they're still in the garden, right? So if we kill the ones in the compost pile, we haven't killed the ones in the garden, so we still have pathogens. There's lots of pathogens in soil as well. They're on our hands and so on. Now, maybe if we're using some animal manure and that animal was sick and they might transmit a pathogen and you might want to kill that. The concern of those pathogens in compost is pretty low, and I don't think that's a good reason to make this hot. So if you want to make cold compost, go right ahead. It works just as well as hot. When that composting process is finished, we have the same material, whether we did it fast or slow, hot or cold. Everything that's happening there on a molecular basis is exactly the same. It's just a speed issue. And of course, it might be slightly different microbes that are working, right? So in a hot compost, we do have some microbes that are only active at the high temperature. And a cold compost won't have those active. But so what? We're talking about thousands of species of microbes, and we have no idea what microbes are in our pile anyway. So we'll use the ones that like to grow cool and use them to do our composting. What can you compost? Well, there's all kinds of rules about this. I'm going to go through a couple of these. One that comes up all the time is eggshells. I did a little experiment a few years ago where I actually took eggshells and I buried them in my soil. My soil has a pH of about 7.4. And then every year I dug up a little basket of these eggshells to see how well they've decomposed. And after 5 years, they're still there. Now, eggshells have an inner protein skin that decomposes very quickly, but the shell itself doesn't decompose. And in fact, archaeologists find these things 100 years after they've been buried, and they actually use the shells to determine what kind of birds were these people eating at the time they died. So eggshells really don't decompose unless the pH is down below 5, 4.5. Anything above that, eggshells do nothing in the garden, really. The reality is that you can put everything into a compost pile, right? When something dies out in the woods and it sits there, eventually it composts. So you can compost all of these. There are some reasons why you might not want to compost some. So meat, a lot of people leave out, not because it doesn't compost, but it does compost slowly, and it tends to attract animals. Bones really don't decompose in a compost pile. They can be in soil for many, many years before they'll change. The third one on the list there is not something you would normally put in a compost pile, but it's kind of an interesting topic, I think. We now have these compostable plastics. You can get drinking cups, and they're right on the front it says compostable. Well, I have news for you. First of all, there is no accepted definition for compostable. Okay? Everybody uses something different. What we're thinking about when we see compostable, we think that we can put this into a compost pile and something will happen to it. That's rarely the case. Plastic doesn't decompose. Most composting facilities, these are the commercial ones, do not compost the plastic because they're not set up for it. Is it compostable? Yes, it is. You need a much higher temperature, and you have to compost it for a very long period of time, and then that plastic breaks down. Things that are labeled as compostable plastics are not, and that includes things like most of our tea bags now are made out of plastic. If you use things like the Jiffy pots, the things that come as little discs that expand, and then you plant your seedling in there, the netting on those is also compostable, but it doesn't compost. It'll sit in your soil for several years before it'll disappear. Rose clippings will compost, but I typically don't put them in there because if I put them in my compost pile, I'll end up with them stuck in my finger at some point. So I usually throw those away. Weeds is controversial. I think it depends on where you're getting your weeds from. If you collect weeds that are not flowering and are not going to seed, then they're not an issue anyways. What I do with a lot of weeds is I'll pick them and I'll just lay them on the ground for a day or two, let them dry out, and then throw them in the compost pile. And quite honestly, things that are seedy, things like, say, dandelions that are, the seeds are flying all over the place, you've got them all over your property anyways. Whether you put those in the compost pile and then move it back to your garden doesn't really matter because they're already in the garden anyway. Pet waste is another one that everyone says don't compost pet waste. Again, I don't quite understand that. Now, I wouldn't go down the street and get waste from somebody else's pet maybe because I don't know if they have been treated or if they have diseases or something. But if these are your pets and creating waste, you are exposed to their waste all the time. Every time you handle them, when they sit on your lap, when they're sitting on the couch and you scoot them off and you sit down, you're being exposed to their waste material. So you might as well use the compost because it's better than what you're exposed to anyway. For the most part, pet waste is not an issue. For the most part, human waste isn't an issue either. But of course, there are some diseases you could get from both of those. I guess if you want to be 100% safe, you don't compost those. Here's a topic that's a little off the side. So what is humus? This is something I believed my whole life until about 3 or 4 years ago, and I started digging into this and learned a whole bunch about humus. I mean, our compost is finished, we put it in the garden, and that goes through a continual process of decomposing, and at some point it's humus. And humus is this good stuff in the soil. It makes it healthy, it grows plants, it does all kinds of great things. Well, maybe not. We're not talking about this kind of humus. So what is humus? Well, most people think it's the end process of composting. It's the long-term thing. After 5-10 years, that compost material has turned into humus. Once it's humus, it's stable for a very long time. I mean, I've seen people say, well, 100 years, maybe 1,000 years. We don't really know, but it's extremely stable and it just sits in soil. It's extremely important in that soil. It's made up of humic acid, fulvic acid, and humate are the 3 main things people talk about. So this is the traditional view of humus, right? We start with organic matter, a banana peel, and it slowly decomposes and gets smaller and smaller, and the molecules get smaller and they're broken apart and they get smaller and smaller. Now we're at a point where we have nutrients and nitrates released, the phosphates released, and then suddenly, by magic, we have humus. And humus are these huge molecules that no one's been able to define. Okay, we don't know the molecular structure of this. In fact, humus has been studied for over 200 years, and we still don't know what the structure is. Now, if you go and Google that, there are people who will say, oh, it's sort of kind of this formula, and we know some things, there's these carbon rings in there and so on. But you won't find any formula for humus. We still don't know what it is. We do know it's large, but that's all we know. And that last step, from very small molecules to big molecules, nobody has ever come up with any explanation of how that happened. And that's one of the things that that kind of fascinated me and started getting me to ask questions about this. Well, how does this happen? Again, I'm a chemist, so things don't go from small molecules to large molecules unless there's some sort of an enzyme, protein doing that sort of stuff. It just doesn't happen on its own. Well, here's some science of humus. So as I said, it's been studied for more than a couple hundred years now. We don't know what it is. We don't know how it's formed. And the last one here I think is really critical. Nobody has ever seen humus in soil. Now that may shock you and surprise you. We've seen humus, we can bottle it, but we can't see it in soil. No one's taken soil and looked at it with a microscope or with any other kind of instrument and said, there's the humus. That's the stuff we've been looking for 200 years. The reason is humus doesn't actually exist. I'm going to present this as new science, new thinking. So there was a paper published 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that, that went through this. And it's interesting that this same concept was published about every 30 years for the last 200 years. So one of the initial researchers back in the late 1800s, he studied it for many years and then finally came to the conclusion, humus doesn't exist. But nobody believed him. And even today, not everyone believes what I'm going to tell you here. But I think more and more soil scientists are starting to believe this now. It's very hard to change your mind on this when you've been studying humus for the last 20 years, and now you have to admit it doesn't actually exist. So here's what really happens in soil. So on the left there, we start with our banana peel, our large molecule. They get composted, just like we said, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Those small molecules now get used up by plants and microbes. And what does a plant or a microbe or a human do when we absorb some nitrate molecules or some phosphate molecules? Well, we use those to build large molecules. And so inside our bodies, we take that and we build the DNA molecules. We build large protein molecules, carbohydrate molecules. All the big molecules in our bodies are built up from these tiny original nutrient molecules. And so we make big molecules. Then we die, or we excrete them. Plants will lose a leaf and it falls to the ground. That leaf is full of large molecules. So we have this cycling around. Microbes don't live very long. So bacteria, if they live for 2 or 3 days, that's a good life for bacteria. Constantly taking small molecules, building them up into large molecules, and then dying, and they're being added to that pool of large molecules at the beginning. What humus is, all of this together in the soil. It isn't really anything special. It's just all of this organic matter in the soil. So how did people study humus for 200 years? Well, the only way to study humus is you take your soil sample and you treat it with either very alkaline solutions, things like sodium hydroxide, or very strong acid, and you extract stuff out of it. And that stuff turns out to be black, and it looks like stuff, and they study that. So no one has actually ever studied humus in soil. We only study the extracted black stuff from soil. One thing that happens when you treat things with strong acids and strong alkali, we completely change the structure. We change the whole chemistry of the material we're looking at, so we're no longer looking at the original material. So when people talk about humic substances, and those are the fulvic acids and the humic acids and the humates, those are man-made. They don't actually exist in soil. And in fact, commercial products are mostly made from coal. So they take a low brown coal, a low grade coal, and they go through that same extraction process. They end up with some black stuff and they dry it and they make it into powder and so on. And then that's sold as our humic substance. And of course, a lot of claims are made for these materials. And we're not really sure what they actually will do in the soil, but they don't actually exist in soil. We do know that.